Before we begin this episode, I just want to quickly let you know that, in fact, we recorded it 6 months ago in the height of summer. And that was deliberate, Ra, Egypt, sun, summer, and so on. And I lent into that, and I was going to bring it out in conjunction with a solo show about how you actually kind of can make the Kybalion hermetic. And I was going to do that in Canberra. If you've watched my animism series, you know I went to an ancient Egypt exhibition there. That didn't really work out. But I clung onto this idea of bringing the Magical Egypt episode out at the same time as an episode about the Kybalion, which I'm still going to do. But summer became autumn, and amusingly, here I am, literally in the dead of winter. I just drove through the snow to get here, and I guess the time is right. It's kind of funny because maybe it's appropriate that there's like a curse of the mummy about it, because the episode itself was a bit cursed. We had technical difficulties and had to film it over a couple of days. It's all edited, it's all fine, you won't see any of that. But we had technical difficulties, and then it took me 6 months due to strange planning to actually get the episode out. The only reason I'm mentioning this at all is that we talk about the episode of Magical Egypt as if it's just come out, when in fact it is already out. That's just my little introduction to let you know that this episode is 6 months late. Most of that's on me, not gonna lie, and it doesn't really change anything except the dates of some of the stuff we were discussing. Anyway, on with the episode, enjoy. This week, I am very, very pleased to welcome to the show the producers and showrunners for the legendary Magical Egypt, some personal friends of mine, Chance and Vanese. Welcome aboard.
Thank you.
Thank you, darling. I love to be called a showrunner.
Yes.
I've never been called that before. That's so Game of Thrones. It's fabulous.
She can call a hit on anyone in the production.
That's true. That's true. That we are looking at a lot of them right now. You should be worried.
I sleep with one eye open.
Well, I'm very excited to have this conversation because the new series is out, or at least it's coming out in exciting installments, and which has begun. So I'm super excited to jump into that conversation. But even though I know you guys, you are first-time guests, so you get to answer the traditional first question. And I think we might go alphabetical. We'll go with Chance. Were you a weird kid?
The obvious answer is I'm still a weird kid. I didn't have time in my youth. I was starting a business and dealing with things. And so now, as I'm approaching 60, I finally get to be the weird kid I always was. I had classic outsider syndrome, Gordon, like I think you did. I went to a private school, and I had to interact with public school kids on the bus every day. And it was just this intense reinforced reminder of how I was not part of the good thing. And then as an artist and a musician, and I hate sports and just literally everything you could do to make sure you never get laid as a kid. Didn't.
I wouldn't know anything about
but,
that.
As you know, it's hard enough to be an artist or anything. And so because I went to a different school, I think you had a similar experience. When I finally went to high school in my senior year, the stuff I learned in private school in sixth grade was what they were teaching in high school, in school in this town where my parents lived that I ended up. After my conduct got me kicked out of private school. So, yes, I was an intensely weird kid, and I had it knocked out of me early on to even try and assimilate, because luckily I was born in Las Vegas, and I don't need to say more about that, but then imagine a person that was born and potentiated for Las Vegas, and then I went to lumberjack town where 5 butchers and no library. And so, yes, I was a bit of an outsider, and all of those things that lead us to blaze our own trail, like this character here has done recently.
Yeah. Did you know, did you find out, was you in the process of being kicked out of a private school, for instance, did you know you were probably heading in a creative trajectory, or was there a come to Jesus moment when you discovered creative industries and creative outlets like music and film and so on, that was like a later salvation story perhaps? Or was it like, no, fuck all of this shit anyway, because I'm not going to have much use for it?
When I was very young, my parents are both writers, and my father's an amazing artist, and he was a sculptor and a painter, and he would just do things when we were young. I lived way out in the country, by the way. I didn't see a frame of television until I was 12 or 13 or something. So you had to make your own fun. And my father was always doing sculpting and stuff. And one time he got this just blank roll of film, and he got this is funny to me because most of my life's been taken up with animating. But I sat at a living room table and watched him draw images frame by frame on a roll of film, which was astounding to me. And I'd never occurred to me that this is how cartoons happen. But just watching things like that and literally having nothing to do except art and writing. I tried to write for a long time. I was a terrible, very self-conscious, ham-handed writer. And then later in the post-LSD phase of my life, I suddenly had a gift that just was there all the time, but I didn't know how to operate that particular mouth. Pain. I hadn't experienced pain or suffering yet. So when I got older and I'd been run through the mill a couple of times, I got a lot more comfortable at writing. But I've always been a visual artist, and I've always loved to do it, and I've always drawn, and I've always I was a first generation that was paired up with a computer. You know, when I went to school, the one class I failed in all of my visual art school and my communication degree was mechanicals. So you might know this. You have to have glue, actual glue in a pot, and you have a printer. It's like as big as a newspaper, a printed page. And you take an X-Acto and you cut out sentence by sentence and you paste them up by hand with your ruler and everything. And within about 4 minutes into the endeavor, I'd been covered in glue and everything was covered and this coffee was spilled and I couldn't stand it. And I was the first season of our school where I got paired up with a computer and I never had to touch glue again. And my core education was as a typographer and a graphic designer. And I was the first immaculate conception. I was the first generation to never have to use storyboards, to never have to use film or paste up or anything. And it was entirely digital. And I watched it go on like a steamroller to destroy the lives and careers of hundreds of people, you know, linotype operators and typesetters and printers and printing press people. And it's still going. It's still eating up. It's a black hole that's eating up careers and stuff. But at a certain point, I was really radicalized when I met John West. And like many young people, I have a voice, I have creative chops, I have the ability to project my voice through images and whatever. But for a long time, I didn't have anything to say because I was just so spellbound by what was going on television, this box that comes into your house and sucks your life and your attention away and leaves you no time for anything else. And then now that we've traveled, as you've just done, you realize the rest of the world hasn't been sitting there staring at this box like we have, and that we've got some catching up to do. And scene.
Yeah. Nice one. I love that. Denise, same question. Were you a weird kid?
Oh, darling, I was a little show-off entrepreneur as a child, growing up in an entertaining.
She was a millionaire by 7.
I had an ice cream stand, but my parents were entertainers, and so we had a very showbiz life. And my father was also a publisher. He published, in fact, I don't even know if you know it, but in Australia there was a book called The Guide to the Occult, and my father published that. So we had many occultists kind of running around the house and lots of kind of weird occult activities going on. So I don't know if I was so much a weird child, but I was in a really creative and exciting environment. And it was my mother died at 16, so from 0 to 16 was absolutely fabulous, and then the shit hit the fan. So, you know. But yeah, it was really, really fun, creative childhood.
So that's interesting to me. So you grew up Addams family, right? Like, so there was like weirdness and creativity. That means you don't necessarily have to find it. Is there a reverse experience as you reach adolescence and adulthood when it's like, oh, wait a minute, everyone else doesn't know about this stuff. Like it's not part of the cultural fabric to be talking about these things. Did you get a disenchantment moment of like, oh, wait, hang on? Or I mean, does any of that stay with you, or is it a process of recovering it over the, let's say, magical Egypt journey?
Look, one of the parts of this journey was that my mother's sister, when they were young children, they were playing with a Ouija board, and something came over my aunt, and she was never the same. Her voice dropped. She started talking in this crazy, angry kind of tone of voice and said to my mother, "You will die of cancer." And my aunt ended up being schizophrenic after that, and my mother ended up dying of cancer. So that was kind of where my confidence and comfort with occulty things kind of fell right out when my mother died, because that premonition came true. So from there, which is actually weird, I went on to run a psychic hotline, and I am probably the most read woman in the planet because
People don't know that Vanese literally invented this little thing called the psychic hotline, which generated more money for a while than the internet will for the next 100 years. There was so much money, and she thought it up, and she just skated this line like, why can't people phone in and pay us money to have psychics tell them what's going on? And so she ran an empire for a while.
Well, it wasn't really my idea. It was my ex-husband's, but I did run it, right? And so I marketed it, and I managed the people. And as I said, I interviewed 5,000, I don't know, psychics, astrologers, and tarot readers.
She made it a thing. She invented an industry that didn't exist before.
Anyway, that associating with these people in such close contact enabled me to develop some comfort again with the occult, because tarot cards scared me.
Oh, yeah.
They absolutely scared me. And, and I had an astrologer tell me the story that I was a witch in a past life, and that's when my fingernails wouldn't grow. And all of a sudden I had the tingles and the fingernails started growing again like crazy. So slowly but surely my comfort with the occult grew. And I started dabbling with astrology. And then I don't really know where my passion for magic, where it started, but it kind of became an obsession. And that's obviously how I found you, and how I found Lon, and how I found a lot of people in the show, just because I became really fascinated with this. And so it is probably a recapitulation of something that happened before my mother died. But the cutoff point really was the death of my mother, where the whole world just went and, had to build it back, put it back together.
Yeah. Explain to me, that's a great and fascinating story that has some follow-up questions implied in it. But you were about to say, I probably read more books than, and that was in the context of running the psychic hotline. So tell me how those two overlap.
Oh no, what I mean by that, I was read. So to test the people to work in the psychic hotline.
Yeah. Okay. Now, you've been like a guinea pig, like a CIA experiment. You're like the material that all the psychics use. You know what? That's quite good, because you did lose a parent at a young age. There's a bunch of things that are in there that makes you actually pretty good test material, because if they don't get that, that's you got to health issues with an aunt, a parent passed. Yeah, that's good. You actually would be a pretty good reader. Or being read, yeah.
Well, what was really interesting about that, Gordon, is, as I said, I don't know, it was somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000, but there was a certain point where I wasn't able to be read anymore. I became unreadable, and it wasn't anything that I was doing deliberately. It was just like I would sit in front of the chair, and they were like, I'm not getting nothing. So I had to end up hiring people to do my job, because I just disappeared from vision all of a sudden.
The oven doesn't recognize Venice's existence. She puts her finger on the oven and it ignores her, and we go to the doors.
Automatic doors.
I have to walk in the store first, or we'd never get in. Yeah.
But I don't know.
See, I have the opposite problem. I blow up ATMs. Like, I have the opposite problem. Like, I can't use ATMs. There you go. Yeah. Oh, well.
But
that's
it was
cool.
it's a really weird phenomenon. Yeah. I don't know. I really don't understand why that's the case, but I loved that. And I think working in that environment was really, really interesting to me, because what it did is it enabled me to see patterns in the universe, right, that did not make sense at all. Where, for example, people that were survivors of substance abuse, we had like this phone system where the phone calls would come in randomly, except they might allocate it to who would take best advantage of it, right? So if somebody was a long talker, they would get priority over a short talker, because we were billing by the minute, right? So the algorithm wasn't set up to put a caller who was a survivor of substance abuse with a survivor of substance abuse, or somebody who'd been molested with somebody who'd been molested. But naturally, the universe did these kinds of crazy things, right? And there was a situation where the girlfriend was in Chicago and she would get one psychic, and then the boyfriend was in California and he would be the next phone call to the same psychic when there's 400 in the room, right? So all of these really, really kind of weird things that were not explainable in our materialist paradigm happened on a daily basis. And that really enabled me to get kind of comfortable with things that are not as we can measure them with a ruler, if you will.
I love that. There's something about that. So I've been doing at least 8 clients a week this year, even in Paraguay and wherever. And something's happening where I'll get to the end of a client week. And if I look in aggregate at the healing journeys they're on, they map to something in my life. And like, there'll be something that I will have done on the weekend that works, that's like directly relevant. And something is going on now that I have a sufficient amount of data over the course of a year where that supports that, which is like, how did, in a seemingly random situation, people get matched up in a way that they most needed? I understand exactly what you mean there, because I get to the end of my workday and I'm like, that's
really weird.
Of all the people that come, and I mean, I'm professionally weird, so are you now, but of all the things that could, and what I think about that in the sense of allopathy is dreadful in most instances from a medical perspective, but it has no way of optimizing for that. I do think it happens in allopathy as well, where it turns out that, as a matter of fact, your dentist knows the naturopath that has the solution for your autoimmunity. I do think there's like a clunky version of it going on in any kind of healing system. But I'm noticing exactly what you meant there. But you just have bigger numbers, right? Like, that's weird. That how are these things matching up? The universe wants to heal, amongst other things, I think.
It was really, look, it was a fun time. Just having that many people around me too that were kind of left of center was really fabulous. I was like trying to manage, wild cats at the same time, but it was a really fun and stressful time. And it gave me, like, there are a lot of ideas that are kind of fuzzy, and I'm trying to kind of get some definition on them. But there was a lot of, as I said, really opening up to more than meets the eye, working with these people, because they were involved in magic and astrology and tarot and palm reading. And, I really got a sense that, reading my eye was the same as reading my hand, which is the same as reading my numbers, which is the same as reading my birthday. And how the hell does that happen? Like crazy things like that just kept repeating over and over again. And it just really gave me kind of an openness to this other world that we all participate in.
I love it. All right. So I think we should, because you're going back to Chance's story, I'd like you to tell us the story of meeting John Anthony West, and then we'll do the story of why he was such an important person to have met. So tell us how you came to him, and then we'll do a bit on Jaws himself.
There's a 6-hour version of this. I'm trying to reach for the 3-sentence version. I had, instead of having a social life and playing grab ass and working on my social life, I just sat in a chair for about 15 years, and I did animation, graphics and stuff. And went right out of school into this job, opened up a graphic design shop that became an animation shop. I got a contract for a video game, like an $870,000 contract, which is not good to do for a young person with no self-control. But I did that, got even better at my craft. But I was an animator. I was a graphic designer at heart. But once I started animating and creating digital environments, it was just this fantastically gratifying way to express myself. And at the time, video games were going in 2 different directions. There was the brilliant, brain-inducing search and explore, these beautiful, rich environments that are all brain teasers and puzzles and stuff. And then suddenly this new thing came along, Quake, where you walk around and shoot things. And guess which way the world went? Walk around and shoot things in simple brick environments that, I didn't want to have much to do that. So I was obsessed with ancient Egypt in particular, because this big contract that I'd gotten was for a video game, and I got to design it. And since so many kinds of art direction for video games had been done to death and were tropey, I said, let's do an ancient Egypt themed thing. And I knew very little. It was a strange thing. And before that, my whole growing up in private school, I would have to wait for 2 hours before my parents got off work to go home. So I'd go to the library and I'd sit in the art book section, I'd look at pictures of ancient Egypt and then forgot all about it. Went through puberty, had a career, and then suddenly remembered, oh my God, this thing I love that I never get enough of is this genuine Egyptian imagery, not stupid Hollywood embarrassing imagery, but the real aesthetic from Egypt. And I didn't realize till later that we're all trying to reconnect with these moments in our previous lives that we recommend. And that's such an iconic thing. And the reason we all have these different relations to it, because we all have different ways of pretending that we're not looking at past lives. And we've been so conditioned to think that there is no such thing. So you have all these weird pre-built attractions and compulsions and these just memories of like something really goddamn important is tied up with me and my chemistry in this place that I've never been to before. And I could never figure out why does this make me so excited to, so I'm working on this thing, big fat contract, all the money in the world. I thought unspendable amount of money. Boy, was I wrong about that. But I went to the library one night, Scripps Ranch Library in San Diego, and arms full of books. And I took them home, and most of them were from Zahi, and they're big, beautiful photographs. And I was stealing textures and stuff like that. And then I found this weird little rag, looked like it came from a discount bin in a pornography store, a serpent in the sky. It was called this weird, angry, like dude, East Coaster. And I'm sitting there looking at all these other books, and I have a pretty significant deadline coming up. And this book, I just can't put this book down, Serpent in the Sky, and every page, it was like something punched me. I bought a Confucius book recently, and every time I'd open the page, he would punch me with something like, why didn't I think of that? And so John West, every page, wham, wham, wham. And it was this rap. Nowadays, they call it some color of pill, but those words didn't exist back then. But I'd suddenly realized in this one particular context, I didn't realize it was all of life and all of world. But my whole understanding of this giant important thing has been entirely curated, and it's not based on the truth. It's based on these political obviations and the power of, the papacy over history and all the stuff that you say in the show. Folks, by the way, Gordon delivers the first of the best payloads in the show. When he talks about history, it's a point I've been making forever. And it's funny that we've never collaborated before because we're shouting the same thing on the roof, that the thing you think of as history is a group of propagandistic facts. Some of them are true, some of them are not. Almost all of them are taken out of context. So when I first started realizing that there's this thing that I hoped and I projected into Egypt, and every time I'd open up a Zahi Hawass book, he was the cop. Well, nothing to see here, folks. You don't have to go home, but you can't stay here. Just, and it was that, like when we landed on the moon. Why did you go out of your way to make that so boring and unwatchable if you're not, anyway? So after I had that feeling that everyone has with Egypt, that there's this basic facts that the aesthetics tell you. And then if you're a geologist or if you're a doctor or an engineer, everybody who goes there sees that this is so much more than we were told. And then John West, this crinkly, spiky little guy, old world, very Alan Watts. There's an old gentlemanliness and a vanished masculinity that are a product of an education system that doesn't exist. Like you were a genius if you got out of school back in the 40s and 50s. You had an actual functional education. And then since the 20s, as we know, industry's been nipping and tucking the things that are available to us that, reduce our ability to be a wild card for industry. And, the schools are this homogenation factory. And so there's things in the world where you just see there's something really serious going on here. And there's authority standing between me and it, providing a duck blind and telling me the things I'm seeing aren't really there. So I saw this gentleman, John Anthony West, who was pointing to another troublemaker from the 40s, Schwaller to Lubicz. And it was so exactly confirming of all the things that I had noticed. I mean, you're an artist too. Aesthetics speak to you in this way. And if I stand between you and a painting and tell you what to think of that painting, I'm going to be drowned out by the power of the aesthetics and the beauty and the genius. And for me, the organic geometry, there's the phi and pi,
golden ratio,
the golden ratio, the phi spiral, golden section, indie graphic designer. Like I paid a substantial amount of money for my education. And in the whole 4 years of my last degree stretch, one time the golden section was mentioned. It's also this mathematical thing that's incorporated into the Parthenon. And then as I got older, I'm like, I think there's something a lot more important than that. I don't know if you've seen the first season of Magical Egypt, but we hooked up with this guy in San Francisco. And when I say we hooked up, now, when Michael Schneider and us were, we had a good time in San Francisco at the Botanical Garden, but he was a geometer who just showed me with a pineapple and a cabbage, and living in California, there's palm trees everywhere, and there's all these expressions of the Fibonacci sequence. And in the mind and the marketplace, it shows you that we're not as separate from nature as we think, because even our aggregate behaviors correspond to the Fibonacci proportions and stock markets and stuff. So everything that's conscious seems to have some kind of weird dance that we can't quite figure out with these proportions and whatnot. And so as an artist, I always saw that Egypt really speaks in these universal constants, but also these rules of aesthetics. Literally the rules, very few people in the States would even admit there's laws of beauty. There's inarguable, incontrovertible laws of beauty. And if you do this, you will produce something beautiful. And if you don't do this, symmetry and golden section and whatnot. So there's this beautiful pre-existing symmetry that seems in some way to be the expression of the consciousness of the universe. And the reason that we respond to them, there's no real reason why my eyes would dilate and my galvanic skin response would change when I see a perfect graphic design example, but I do, it does. We have physical autonomic responses to seeing actual beauty. So the organic fiveness that spirals in a flower, or Michael Schneider in this amazing book, Hitchhiker, The Beginner's Guide to Constructing the Universe. Amazing book, and you'll never see the universe the same way. Before we started the podcast, we were talking about this, the next episode of Magical Egypt is called Digital Doppelganger. And it's about how we've been very slowly migrated off of actual meat and dirt reality onto this ideological digital environment. And one of the things that's not transferring with us is, sex and tantra and masculinity and all these things, organic, non-chemical, non-GMO foods. But also these fundamental senses. We keep getting stripped down. We're a tree that keeps getting its branches cut off because every artist knows you have a lot more than 7 senses. We've recently been reading Powerology by Ingo Swann about how it really does perpetuate good marketing if everyone's miserable, and that the more senses you don't know about, the less powerful you're going to be, the less of a challenge you're going to be to power. And so the art and the history and the tradition, Machiavelli spoke about this quite well, but it's only gotten more acute. One of the things that is a detrimental development in the education program is not just pulling art out of schools, completely depriving your right hemisphere of anything to do for most of the day, but fundamentally, we've been reconditioned to not pay attention to these really important senses and attributes, and they really are cities. Like if I hadn't known Venice, I'd have never known that word, S-I-D-D-H-I, city, a superpower. Everyone who watches Marvel, because that's in the zeitgeist, that we have these weird unflipped DNA switches of things that are miraculous powers. That's not an abstract. That is absolutely true. And there's something about the Western culture that's predicated, that necessitates the fact that we have to ignore most of what we are. And we have to be these mechanical, physically based things because reasons, because 20th century industry and whatnot. And all of these other creepy power reasons that just make you seem insane. But so when you get out into the world, and I started seeing that there was these beautiful things that just spoke to me, and they were like medicine. And for some reason, there seemed to be this organized attempt to keep me from knowing about it. And it wasn't so much that they were mad at the Egyptians. You made a really good point in the show that it's hard not to see a tiny bit of that race can't have built that because they're not as smart as us. Like, it's absolutely there. But there's something a little more insidious, that there seems to be something about this place that makes me remember something about myself that I'm not supposed to know. So one last sentence, I'm going to say this really tightly. The Devas and the Asuras. We went to Cambodia recently, and the whole thing is this giant expression of this ageless legend, this mythos. 2 groups of magical people, angels and devils, basically, Asuras and Devas. The Asuras, the devils, tricked the Devas into submission and slavery by casting a magic spell that made them forget who they were. They were suddenly unaware of all the magical powers and properties they had, so they were disempowered, and they lived as slaves under the Asuras until Vishnu, who sits at the top of the pole in all these depictions, controlling the 2 sides of Congress, the Devas and Asuras, intervenes on behalf of the Asuras, gives them this magical elixir, which is a very tantric conversation that we can have later. But by restoring their memory about who they were, all they needed was to be reminded, oh, that's right, I'm a superpower thing, and I can fly, and I can move backward and forward in time, and all of these constraints that the devils put on me to keep me subjugated. went away like that the minute I remembered it. So the great thing about Ingo's Powerology book is no matter how much they change reality, no matter how much they program us and nip and tuck things off of us to disempower anybody who's ever drank NutraSweet and has a tiny little BB for a pineal gland, we are neutered on so many levels. The casualness with which we'll cut our animals' testicles off. Like, I don't ever want to be owned for how, like one of these days when aliens come, there's going to be retribution for how quickly we were neutering people, but it's happened to us as citizens. Anybody who's ever drank NutraSweet, anybody who's all of these things. We just found out, by the way, you cannot operate a Vamana if you've been circumcised.
Interesting.
You with that. That's a deep fucking well, and it's going to lead you to some place that you realize we're on a goddamn farm.
Yeah. Super interesting. Round 2, take 2. Here we are the very next day after having a little bit of a Mercury retrograde situation here. And the discussion was whether we attempt continuity or go in another direction, like wear a horse costume and just not mention it. But we are back after
we actually have a unicorn, if that would count for anything.
well, the second half of the episode, but it's funny, like Mercury giveth and taketh away, because it was actually a really nice card. Because we wanted to get back to Vanese. You had a story about John Anthony West, and we were picking up the show from how chance went from reading the strange blue book to actually meeting the man himself. But let's do that.
All right, darling. Well, what I was going to say about John is that, and I think this also has to do with how many people were really enthralled with the first magical Egypt. And as I mentioned yesterday, we had millions and millions of views on our YouTube. Well, not on our YouTube channel, because it was actually, what do you call it when people steal it and post their stuff?
There was a period where the entire infrastructure of the internet was held aloft by bootleg copies of Magical Egypt. 300 million views in a single site. Wow. And there was like a dozen of those sites that had 3. And we found out later, doing some forensic accounting, that somebody's made a lot of money back when YouTube would pay for views, you know?
But anyway, what I think was the key point is that people who are interested in ancient Egypt had a degree of cognitive dissonance about the story that you're told in school, right? The history lessons, Egypt 101. And so along came John, and, John's own insight, as well as what he was able to draw from Schwaller to Lubicz, and came with a story that may or may not be 100% correct, but it made a hell of a lot more sense to people. Things started to add up, and it kind of verified their internal, questions about what they'd learned in history. And I think that is really what John did. And actually, if you've seen, you have seen the new episode, I talk about the fact that Egyptology has gone through, incredible falls and peaks and valleys in terms of how they viewed the ancient Egyptians. And kind of just when John came on the scene was really one of the lowest points of how Egypt was observed in academia and Egyptology. Like they said, they were pre-philosophical and didn't understand what phi and pi was, and
it's the peak of the gaslighting that after everyone else who's just listened to it a few moments ago, that Chance was talking about yesterday. It's the peak of the gaslighting. Like I was thinking when he was talking that Richard Dawkins wrote a book called The Greatest Show on Earth, and it's the ultimate philosophical gaslighting because it's boring, disgusting, meaningless materialism. The greatest show on earth. Are you fucking with me at this point, right? And I love that about John at the very beginning. I think it needed someone who had his panache and his charm and capacities to lift stuff up from like a really, really low place. And it's an important point with Egyptology because it began effectively as an esoteric discipline. It calls itself a science in the same way I might call myself a scientist. Like, come on now, come on. But that's very important for people to understand. That I wrote this in Star.Ships. Like, no, this is ours. This is ours. You're playing in my sandpit. I'm not playing in yours. And that's a key shift. And it's super important for everyone to go with this episode, right? Because Egypt is the mirror of heaven. Mirrors reflect a lot of things. That's what Egypt is for. Like we're supposed to see dare I say, ourselves at our best or our truest when we look at Egypt. And that, like, this is really important with John. Like, it doesn't matter the things he got right or wrong. To champion a symbolist approach was essential.
He was remarkable in so many ways, but one of the things that I think really made him immortal is he had this absolute firm grasp on where the cliff was. He could walk right up to the cliff. And then where Gaia people or any one of those shows that's just a circus of clowns talking, there's no line in the sand like, here's where my credibility ends. John had such a firm understanding. Another thing about John that people don't realize is he did not come from academia or scholarly. He had a vitriolic hatred of academia. But what he did, he was a theater guy. He came from theater. So his voice, like, it's a strange thing to talk about someone with such an intellect, but a big part of John's presence was this beautiful Alan Watts kind of resonant, just unbelievable voice. And the drama and the theatricalness, and also he had this thing about him, very Christopher Hitchens. He had a wit and a stinger that would come down, and you didn't see it coming until you're just like, what the hell was that? I seen him dismantle people. And what was really tragic about that was John was born. John really was the Christopher Hitchens of ancient Egypt in a sense. And then because it was such an easy thing, they did the same thing to Jack Parsons. When Jack Parsons was forbidden to go into the alumni room in that place where Einstein used to teach, in Pasadena, Caltech. They used credentials. May I see your credentials? May I see your Egyptology pass, please? Because nothing you say is going to matter. You know, they appeal to authority. It's such a, there's only 7 ways to lie. There's only 7 classic lie structures. And the one that I can't believe they don't teach this in grade school, the appeal to authority. Nothing you say matters because you're not a credentialed Egyptologist. So he had to get over that before he even got started. And another tragic thing in a Joseph Campbell kind of sense, he was the ultimate David and Goliath. He was the little guy with truth on his side. Like Rene Descartes always said, the majority can be perfectly whatever, perfectly in agreement, perfectly in alignment, and perfectly wrong. And one person shows up with goods, everyone, and you can imagine why they reacted the way they did.
John was a remarkable man in so many ways. One of the things that just always impressed me when he was out in the field, or even in a casual moment, he never backed down from a challenge, and he was always up for a little bit of scrapping. And he had this wicked ability to, he was completely calm, like this very deceptively deep river. But when he'd take an interest or dislike in something you've said, man, this stinger would come down and he would eviscerate people. It was a remarkable to watch. And he had such an incredible knowledge base. But the thing that I liked so much was, unlike, most academics and quote unquote experts, he had this certainty and this absolute resoluteness, and he had this just magical will about, there's no question when you're in his presence. Like standing next to George Carlin when someone tries to censor you, there's a sureness and a willful, boom, I am not interested in your opinion. Here's what reality is. And he was great like that. And it's the reason why so many people had to team up to bring him down and silence his voice. Because as you know, and as I think everyone in this group knows, you can't blot out the sun. You can't hide the moon. You can just throw up a bunch of flack and tell rumors about how the sun is a slut and you shouldn't listen to it. You can only throw flack. You can't hit his argument. You can't assail his argument. And so it was the reason he was so great to watch in that Joseph Campbell, David and Goliath, little guy takes on the crowd. And he was one of those demonstrators of all those times in history where all the experts were perfectly in agreement. Everyone had no question, and they were all perfectly wrong. There was one person that came along over and over again, Copernicus and Galileo, and John's probably rolling over at the comparison, but John came along at this time, and he was one man with one little sword made of truth, and man, they hated him. So they shut him down. After his first special in early 80s, I think, Charlton Heston, of all people, it's kind of hip because he was Moses and, delivered the children of Egypt, children of Israel, whatever. He literally was shut down. He was canceled before that was a word. The Christian coalitions and all of these shadowy people who don't want to say what their dog is in the race shut him down. They said he will never be on television again. And that was why I thought the most noble thing I could do with the chops that I developed at that time was stop doing this thing that I was sick of. I'd been sick of network work and promo production for 20 years. And I met him right at this time, and it was like, good God, finally someone who sees the world the way I do. He's an avatar of what's right. He's an avatar of the little guy not listening to authority. And he was so well-spoken and so focused. I'm a lot better in writing than I am in person, but I love his books. Like I love Kurt Vonnegut. Like it just feels like you're reading Velvet because of the linguistic skills, but also just this punch in the face, like we spoke about yesterday, like Confucius, this inarguable logic in the middle of this dramatic presentation. And
I want to tell you a story, like for me in school in the 90s, and see if it maps to reading Serpent in the Sky. Because for me, it was Graham Hancock and Heaven's Mirror. But I was studying ancient Egypt in high school. And I felt that disappointing gaslighting that we all feel when we approach something sacred and then we're told it's not sacred. They were stupid. They didn't have the wheel. This is a tomb. Like just garbage, like materialists.
they didn't know what the brain was for. That idea that they literally didn't know what the brain was for, please.
So I get Heaven's Mirror, the book that goes along with the Channel 4 series, and I'm reading through it, and I'm like, wait a minute. This is that moment of like, I have found, and Graham, it's the same as John. It's like there's stuff he's right about, there's stuff he's wrong about, but what he's wrong about is that the official story. I mean, what he's right about is that the official story is wrong, and you find that song in your soul of like, this is true. Even the parts that aren't true are true. This is what it's for. And that's where I think people, I mean, I'm sure listeners to Rune Soup are aware of this, but John Anthony West was absolutely the right personality type and the right background in his own way as an Abita artist and all the rest of it to actually bring the symbolist approach, even without people not necessarily know what that word means, to our read of Egypt. And I say our read because it is our, like the whole point of Egypt, not me specifically, but Egypt in its post-hermetic state is designed like by God or whoever to be engaged with. And he brought that artist's aesthetic, he brought the capacities of translating out of some fairly impenetrable French ideas with that, because the sharpness wasn't just in the mouth, as you say, it was in the mind. It's like, I'm going to ingest this French gobbledygook and it's going to come out as knives.
Yeah, amazing. He was essentially really played the same role as Robert Lawler. Lawler lived with us for a good couple of years on and on.
Well, yeah.
Lawler translated the actual French. He translated Temple of Man, and it's funny to read them both. And also Andre Vandenberg, just three completely different siblings.
Can I just interject?
Yeah.
What's really interesting about the original text is that Schwaller de Lubicz, when he released actually this work that we're talking about, you know, I think you can see me, right? Because he's pulling me over. Yeah. It's just that you're in the screen. Okay. So when Schwaller introduced the Temple of Man, there was a common wall of silence erected around him by Egyptology. So kind of there's an echo from John as what happened. Oh, like there's an echo from Schwaller. The same kind of thing happened to John, right? That these ideas, there's something about these ideas that we recognize in our, like you said, in our soul to be true. But at the same time, they're incredibly threatening or alien or something.
These are the footprints of polymaths. And almost every expert is an expert because they've had this institutional blinders put on. And I don't know a single Egyptologist who's a geometer. I know very few Egyptologists that are musicians. Nobody's a metrologist. Nobody is a Goethean expert on number symbolism. And it's always been the polymath. So Schwaller was this crazy polymath. Schwaller de Lubicz, a French Alsatian person. Interesting, very much like Crowley. Legends of him being a double agent and whatnot. And he was certainly involved in intelligence at a high level. But because he was a polymath and he knew so much about chemistry and physics and mathematics, he was one of the first people to notice things, mathematical things, the presence of the Fibonacci series and the five spirals and whatnot, that Egyptologists, like, what are you talking about? I don't even know what you're talking about. And so early on, what Vanese mentioned, Adrien Driaton, who was the head of the Department of Egyptology at the time. And like you said, by the way, a brilliant thing, if you want to hear a fantastic assessment of ancient Egypt, the latecomer to Magical Egypt, a certain Gordon that we're looking at here. You may remember Gordon from such podcasts as the one we're currently watching. All of these people recognize that there is a built-in redundant proof to this. And if you are a polymath, but what you also said the magic word, if you look at things through aesthetics, there's this delivery vector that only aesthetics can do. Remember that joke that Hitler in a lot of comedy said, "Who do you want me to bomb? England or Paris?" And he says, "Nobody ever says Paris." Like even the Germans. There's an interesting Masonic story, by the way, about Masons wouldn't touch other Masonic structures.
You did such a good point about polymaths, and we were talking about architecture yesterday / earlier in the episode for people listening. Imagine, it's funny for us to be where we are now, thinking with and looking at Egypt. Imagine approaching the pharaonic civilization without an architect or an artist.
Yeah,
like
or a doctor.
What are these people experts in? Like, this is the dumbest thing.
What you just said, Gordon, is so important because it has been dumbed down. The most amazing thing that we've discovered in this last season, it's us that's changed. It's our willingness to believe this false model of reality, that nothing about the facts on Egypt have changed. But as we've shown in season 2, there's actual biomedical charts of the brainstem and specifically these things, the third eye, but they're not stylish symbolism. They're schematics, medical schematics, specifically of the parts of the brain that produce the effect of consciousness. As you know, consciousness is, there's a big problem. We still do not know what it is or where it comes from. And there's, in addition to the million other things that we've pointed out in ancient Egypt, there's a sophisticated science that we've been lied to about, or maybe just because the people that have been studying it are so specialized, they don't see the geometry, they don't see the music, the resonance sciences. Everyone sees the engineering, of course, and everyone sees the art. People like us who are professional, it's my trade is aesthetics, and it's a Bible, and it expresses this genius in we used to say Egypt's like a magic book or like a magic mirror, but it speaks to you in whatever language you show up in, whatever your aptitude or whatever your genius is. Egypt will speak to you in that language. So John had this idea that there was something there, and he pointed us all, me and Brad, and each of us in our time spent some time pilgrimaging with John and him showing us all the concrete evidence of the earlier civilizations. So I came to it with a completely different skill set, and Brad and I are very similar people. But when he started indicating this face of Hathor, who is Hathor, the mother of Horus, the house of Horus, kind of misogynist, calling a mama house, but the Hathor, is primordial fertility and pregnancy. Her face is kind of a cow, but it's this stylized cow that is actually a human uterus. Her ears are the fallopian tubes, and it's just amazing how many biometrically correct details. So John would point out really early things like that when we were on the ground. And then later, Brad and I came home, and Gary Osborne and the whole troop, the core research group. And because we were all artists, and we were all, oddly enough, graphic designers and musicians, I think, lopsided right brain. Egypt, by the way, is a expression of right brain thinking and right brain operation that you don't realize until you study Egypt how many things have been surgically altered in the modern world to shut down the wild card of creativity and genius. And literally our linear language traps us. Everything in society you'll find confines us and traps us, like those cow catchers that keep getting thinner and thinner. We've been linguistically, scientifically, educationally neutered and pared down so that there's only a very few functional things that we actually understand. When people come along with these weird aptitudes, like this ability to understand the resonant properties of a room, or the ability to recognize mathematical structures in 3D space, Egypt talks to you in that language. So for all of us, Brad and I and everybody, the thing that made Magical Egypt significant in season 2 was we absolutely showed beyond the ability to doubt. We're doing a feature film on just this find. We've got Mauro Zapatera and a couple, and Rupert Sheldrake, of course, no slouch in the scientific ring, and a bunch of other amazing people, yourself included, weighing in on this science. And these endocrinologists, brain surgeons have looked at the findings that we found. Here's the brainstem, here's all the articulations of the brainstem, here's this whole class of statue that literally point by point match all the articulations of the brainstem. You have visuals for this that you can show while we're talking about this. But when you sit down, every physician or doctor or surgeon or brain scientist or cognitive scientist I've showed this to, they always sit down with that look on their face like, oh my God, I can't believe you're stealing my time like this. And by the end, they have a different goddamn look on their face because orthodox people have to say, oh, shit. You see this inarguable evidence that they had a sophisticated, like in most things, it seems more sophisticated than we've reached again, because we still don't know what specifically where consciousness comes from. And it doesn't come from the brain. Part of the reason we'll never find it.
I want to go back to like when you Going from reading the blue book to like, oh, I got to meet this guy.
Yes.
How did you find him like yelling at tourists at the Giza Plateau? Like, where was he? Tell us how you met Jaws.
Venice, this is another one of the remarkable unsung facilities of Venice to literally empower the show. I had this just weird fetish for John, and I would watch him obsessively and studied all his shows. And Venice just like did this thing that I never would have thought of. She picked up the phone.
I just rang him up.
Saginaw, and John was like, yeah,
John was like, I'm going to Egypt tomorrow. Come with me.
we called him up. Hi, I love you. I would love to do whatever I can to help give you a voice that was taken away from you, and you got boycotted after your first show. And he goes, well, hey, I'm leaving in 48 hours. And in that time, I decided to abandon my career. It was not an unlucrative career, but I'm coming up on 22, 23 years of being a box jockey at Fox, and I just couldn't stand it anymore. So I abandoned my entire life on a dime, went to Egypt with a small prosumer 3-chip camera, no audio equipment to speak of, no plan, no script, and most importantly, no mandate. No one had asked me to do it. So I went, and I first met him in person in LaGuardia in New York. It was late, and everybody was just tired, and we had the whole place to ourselves, just him and me, and we sat and really exchanged all those, those things that you lay down about yourself, the playing cards. Here's what I do. Here's what we do. And by the end, by the time we landed, he was such a big and caring person. He always knew if he found the right voice in media that it would completely reestablish his presence. And I think even though that word hadn't been invented yet, cancellation, he definitely understood that he had a message that was not organized broadcasting, whatever that turns out to be, the mass behavior modification program that it is. They were not interested in helping John reach people. And it was only through that. And years later, John would never admit this to himself, but it became obvious over the years after I'd known him for so long and the caliber of information he was producing. And then when we went on to produce these genuine scientific findings that are just like, no one's ever going to acknowledge what you've done, because here's the point of this long soliloquy. Reality is curated exactly the way it's supposed to be, and wild cards of information that completely change what we know about ourselves in our past and previous times when people have had this weirdly high evolution have somehow either naturally or artificially been shut down, and it keeps reducing us back to this disempowered state where we're just these meat vehicles, and we've been neutered of our angel wings and all of these psychic 232 senses apparently that we're not being told about. This truncation of what we are and what we think we are, like naming something and making it turn to stone, because until something has a name, it's ephemeral and beautiful, and suddenly it turns into a rock and falls to the ground when you start trying to define it. And so because of his presence and because of his work and the way he laid this information out, he opened this door that really invalidated this. It was more of a societal damper, in my opinion. I think I've gone to some good lengths to show that this isn't about historians' failure to understand what we used to be. This is about the curation of our present social situation, the curation of what we think about ourselves.
Yeah, I agree. I guess at the moment I'm a little bit more optimistic about John having the last laugh, right? Because I think about certainly coming into the 80s, that was the wrong decade to be anything other than materialist. And the 90s was better, and that we did get some Hancock, and then lost it in the noughties. Like I think about it in tentpole TV series. Like the 90s, you would have Buffy and Twin Peaks. The noughties, you had Sex in the City. It's hyper materialist. It's whatever, right? I think, because one of the questions I have for perhaps later in the show, but we'll do it now, is what do you think has changed in culture from the first magical Egypt to now? Because I kind of think whoever we are, quote unquote, are winning, right? Because I just don't think, certainly after the last 3 years, for instance, official narratives in any category work. And to have that hatted lunatic stand up in front of these 3 pyramids and just pronounce bewildering statements that are internally inconsistent anyway, I don't think that works anymore. I think, if you're just speaking of Graham Hancock, the BBC's the BBC's hit on him in the late 90s was the best thing in a funny way that ever happened to him, because he's winning now too. Like no one's listening to these people. And I feel like that's one of the things I want to say in the show is that we owe the current optimism to the work of people like John, right? That's why we're talking about it, because he literally crawled so that we could walk, in the sense that he had to do that for decades. He had to be up against that hyper-materialism for decades to make room for something.
What helped John too is John exercised this kind of mental judo where it's a simple thing, and I don't know why more people don't do it. It's just an unthinkable thought in this day and age. Don't talk past what you actually know. There are whole networks based on only start talking at the place where you don't know what you're talking about. John was so careful, and he had such this metric, and he would just stick to the safety of never saying anything he didn't know, and just the power in. There are other people, I don't want to talk about anyone specifically, but frequently when someone gets into the spotlight, it's suddenly like they've abandoned whatever got them there, and it becomes them. The spotlight's here for me, and it's not like I'm going to take this spotlight and pass it to the thing that we all should be looking at that I'm standing in front of. So John was a really interesting mix of sticking with the science. He never was comfortable in that machine, like I'm famous, look at me, look at me. And because he wouldn't play along, and because he never sold out to the networks, and he was never he loved being on TV, but he hated the network tendency to get him to start talking about UFOs and stuff like that. And he just wouldn't do it because, it's ridiculous. And so it was amazing in that way to see, but also, having been in television my whole life, the whole time I'm like, the thing that you think about this sweet, wholesome world where you can walk up and win if you're the better man. I don't think we live in that world, John. And I'm going to do whatever I can to show the world what you've done. And then for myself, him and I coming together, we took this thing into all of a sudden we're a team of art degree weirdos that are, children of Terence McKenna and Crowley. And suddenly there's things John would not talk about. He was remarkably conversant about magic and occultism, but he was so careful about curating what he said, so he was scientifically and logistically unassailable. So when we came along, we actually have the credentials to talk about art and symbolism and these styles of art. There's this thing that I call like a biometric schematic that's embedded in art. There's lots of different times in history that's been used, but once you uncover what that is, there's these incredibly complicated biometric schematics, and not just of everything, but specifically the machinery that creates consciousness. We've always been told they worshipped weird gods and stuff like that, and it was never worship, it was never religion, they were never gods. Egypt, in all of Egypt, they never said the word gods, it was netters, principles. Their religion was this schematic of consciousness, and the consciousness that's our individual consciousness, the universal consciousness of which we're a little drop, and then this weird tendril where all the psychedelic activity comes through if you have the right catalysts. This was a scientific schematic of consciousness that was holy. It was the central object of revelation and worship to this culture that you might say was the only culture. Well, the whole of that era were expressing science, but they were expressing it in this right brain way. We've been neutered. We have been neutered in right brain activity. So we don't really understand symbolism. You were just saying, people really don't understand what symbolism even is. And it's
that was one of my questions. That was one of my questions, because it's funny, you were talking about consciousness there. John used to say, and this is I suspect a very deliberate half-truth, that Egypt is a single-issue civilization, right? And I like that because he was talking about its afterlife capacities, but it's more like what you were saying, John. It's like if Egypt is a single-issue civilization, it's resonance, it's consciousness. But I like that. But kind of what you were saying there begs the question of people who maybe are unfamiliar with, they probably understand the symbolist read of Egypt intuitively because they listen to a show like this. But let's give it something that it doesn't enjoy, which is a definition. let's give it like what is the symbolist interpretation of Egypt?
Okay, I'll tell you what it is. It's quite simple. It's taken me almost 20 years to be able to say this in a sentence. But when you buy a car, you get an owner's manual. And in the owner's manual, there's an electrical schematic, there's a mechanical schematic, there's a stuff to help you understand how the engine works, stuff to help you take care of the leather, stuff to tell you how to take the ashtray out. There was times in the past when people were right hemisphere dominant, when we had a much more holistic, intuitive, and resonant understanding with reality. When you change something into a word, you kill it. You kill your relationship to it. And we've been systematically, because of science and semantics, chopping our relationship off with everything, turning everything into a stone and into a word. Tell me the question again.
What is symbolist?
So here's what symbolism. This is why symbolism is so hard to talk about. It starts up this whole side of your head.
Yeah.
So Symbolism is the language of your right hemisphere. Your left hemisphere speaks linear language, and it likes to do things in lists and have very overt logic. The right hemisphere is what's involved in poetry and art, and it's associative, and it's really a 3D structure, where the left hemisphere is a 2D structure. Just to cut to the point here, all of Egypt is this scientific expression. It's done in a brilliant way that I particularly love, because my whole background is in 3D art. And what's the difference between 3D and 2D art? Living art, when you incorporate another dimension into art, like the difference between a painting and a sculpture is one more dimension incorporated into art. So using this very specific language of symbolism, which everyone understands what symbolism is, every part of the body, every animal, everything in nature has a very specific symbolist meaning. And the most interesting thing of all is the way your brain works. Your brain works in these octaves, just like music. So Egypt took a look at the world from a completely opposite standpoint than the West, and everything is integrated and everything's one thing. And depending on what level you are, you'll see, your particular level of that one thing. But the entire universe is this one living entity, and we are to the universe what germs are to us, or what a brain cell is to the body. We are part of this living thing. Western science and Western medicine has tried to say we're some oddity because we have consciousness, and that the material world has no innate consciousness. And it's a strange sort of disempowering propaganda that the West has, that the East doesn't have, honestly, and a completely different idea about what consciousness is. The West is very reductive and physical, and the East is all there is consciousness, and the material world is a offspring of
Symbols.
consciousness. So symbols are this right brain way of making schematics. They're just like a scientific schematic, only they use metaphor and actual versions of things in the world
See,
to
that
tell you
metaphor-
how the world is measured. It's like a model of the universe itself.
Yeah. Well, so that metaphor bit I think is important, because what I was sitting with in between yesterday's recording and now, so earlier in the episode, once it's edited. So I read a book a few years ago by a Yuan elder called Uncle Max, and it actually some of this made it into Animistic. And the Yuan people are south coast of New South Wales, and they have a sacred creation mountain, Gulliga. And Uncle Max, who's now passed, would refer to Gulliga as a library, because Yuan would go on country, and obviously we're in a colonial impact where their society has been destroyed by our presence here, right? Destroyed is too strong a word, but you know what I mean. And the ceremonies and the medicine and the learnings are recovered from Gulliga, from the mountain herself, because she is a library, amongst other things. And there is something about that. There's a couple of things I want to say in reference to symbolism and even hermeticism, or the symbolic read of Egypt and even hermeticism, is engagement, full person, so mind, soul, whatever, engagement with Karnak. If you know how to do that right, is going to de-library the medicine that you need in the same way, more or less the same way as the Yuan people and Gulliga, right? And for me, this is the bit that I think, when we look back at Schwaller de Lubicz's impenetrable Frenchness and John's passing of it, and actually, like, I can read, it's a very good example, right? Like, the translation of Temple of Man is actually a really good read, but it's a good example of it. And for me, it's that same idea of engaging to unlock the library, the cosmic library. It's a way of retaining information, and it's a way of learning. And crucially, and here's where I think it's a bit hermetic, right? Something another important philosopher for me, Orland Bishop, says is the answer will not be traditional because the world is no longer traditional. Now, if the universe behaves symbolically, if it's alive, when Napoleon engaged with Karnak, he would have got something different out of the library to when we engage with Karnak now. And that's contained for me in like what I think hermeticism is and what I think symbolism, or the symbolic approach to Egypt is. And Egypt specifically, right? Because it is that mirror. There's something about engaging with it as a library that yields like the most profound medicine that we can find. And that's the way in which John and Schwaller and everyone are right, because they fucking knew that that's in there. It's like, it's fucking in here. It's not
Yeah.
this terrifyingly denatured, flat, demonic, archonic materialism. And it's really
There's some
like, to
mark.
me, yeah, go on. Yeah.
Let him finish.
Yeah,
Let-
go. Sorry.
That was it. That's it. Jump on in.
I blanked.
Your turn to talk, Venice. The boys have been talking.
Look, one of the to kind of answer your earlier question, Gordon, in terms of in kind of relationship to this, what's changed, right?
Yeah.
One of the things that kind of you said to me when I interviewed you for the show was the most simple statement of all that has the most profound meaning. And it's like, we're the most materialist culture. I'm just going to summarize and paraphrase, but basically, we're the most materialistic culture ever, trying to understand what was the least material culture ever. Okay. And that, as I said, that the repercussions of that kind of just echoed and exploded in my mind. And it speaks to kind of what has changed throughout history, why we view Egypt differently, the 70s and the 80s and the 90s and the noughties, right? I think we are slowly moving away from materialism. And I think that as we change, maybe it has to do with astrology or the yugas or who knows, but another point you made is that looking at ancient Egypt is also more about us than it is
Yeah.
about ancient Egypt, right? So that library thing that you're speaking to. So many of the ways that you've been looking at it have been really informative to me in putting together this last episode, right? But I think we're changing. I think we are changing. I think we're becoming less, at the same time as we're becoming more material, there's this really weird thing going on because we have all of this AI and transhumanism and all of these crazy machines that we can't live without. So in one respect, there's a trend towards materialism, but at the same time, there is a counterforce where we're also moving away from it.
I have a point that I wanted to make later in the episode, but I'll do it now because it's exactly that. I think when I think about what hermeticism is, and I spoke about this with some hermetic authors back when I was still living in London, hermeticism it has this sense of urgency and a bundling up of the valuables of the silverware because the project was coming to its ultimate end, like the famous prophecy about what's happening to Egypt, which we could say is now it literally describes the last 3 years, like priests and scientists inverted and all the rest of it. So I think we're in another hermetic moment. I think we're in a moment, and that's why it feels so close to the surface. The sanctity is like, we're in a hermetic moment. We look at the world and go, well, it's barreling into techno-tyranny and World War III. Like, this isn't the beautiful utopia of, oh, now everyone understands spirit. But actually, in Apocalypse one, I think we do. But more importantly, this stuff is close to the surface for people to hermeticize it, to actually send it, keep it safe into the future in the same way that hermetic writers did, like that wisdom of Egypt. Yeah, I think Magical Egypt is literally hermetic in the sense that it is a bundling up of and an invitation to Egyptian wisdom that can transform people. I mean, Rogan, like famously, he's like that show. He's taken a lot of psychedelics, and that show, I think, affected him more than anything else. And that's what it's supposed to, right? Like, that's literally what I can look at that and say, that's a symbolist read of Egypt. Egypt still works for the symbolist. Like, it's still doing its job.
The point of the artwork was this octopus tentacle that got into your head. I was quite surprised when Joe Rogan, I felt like that was a personal failure, honestly, when someone so mainstream and someone like him and completely lacking in hermetic background. I mean, no underpinnings of any of that. I was like, I'm not sure I've done my job right if Joe Rogan loves this show. And I'm not being a dick. I mean, of course I am being a dick, but I'm not trying to. But I'm like, it was honestly like, kudos, man. I completely think differently of this guy from New York, and then it just showed you how no matter who you are, you've had some incarnation, maybe 3, 4, 5, maybe 200 ago, but there's a weird percentage of people who seem to have witness this firsthand. And no matter what you are, what your station in life or what your degree of education is, you recognize. I mean, you don't need much education to recognize. You don't need more than a couple IQ points to recognize this thing that took place in 30 of your past 100 lives, or past 100 lives. I mean, in all of human history, there's very few cultures that have lasted as long as Egypt. So if it turns out that we Western Christians aren't right, I say we Western Christians, our culture brought this idea of, let's laugh at the pagan idea of successions of lifetimes and successions of incarnations. And, you know, we have this just hilarious attitude in the West that we know better than the cultures that are 10 times as older than us. And except for us, every single culture is like, you have lived this succession of lives, this spark that goes from canoe to canoe, meat cycle to meat cycle. And really, this modern world, one of the ways we've been spiritually neutered in this world is not through Roman soldiers anymore. It's through control of information and this uniform stream of information that keeps lying to us about what we are and what we can do. And for some reason, preventing us from understanding that we have this continuity of different meat wagons that we move into over time. And the one thing that we all, the ones of us who aren't non-player characters and, you know, automatons of whatever kind, and man, there might be about 90% of people with no internal voice, as far as I can understand. Everyone recognizes, and kind of the point of this stuff is you recognize, and no matter what you were conditioned to think with your upbringing, there's this knowledge inside of you that is the weird, kind of partitioned off. There's Masonic exercises where you can remove those partitions and remember who you were before. Almost always just causes trouble. Never helps. But that's what that is for. The reason the Masons are so interested in all of this stuff, and the reason why there's such a crossover between hard science that denies the presence of the occult and the occult world. They're like, how come nobody listens to us? We have all the answers you're looking for. We always have. We have a completely articulate, no questions asked read of ancient Egypt. But like I say, it's not ancient Egypt that's mysterious. It's this weird duck-blind culture we live in that regulates your consciousness and regulates the things you can look at.
This is where I think I'm a little bit more optimistic as well, because I like the idea of where you went with past lives and Rogan, but something Jordan Peterson said a couple of months ago, of all people, that Joe Rogan is the most important journalist ever. Like, ever. Not living.
That literally
ever.
makes me sick to my stomach.
Yeah, that's true.
That freaked me out. You're right.
That freaked me out. I had to sit with it going, that can't be right. And I'm like, oh my goodness, that actually is right. That is itself a indication of where society is at. And again, I'm not disparagingly, but that is where we are, right? And so the most important journalist ever is a Magical Egypt stan. I think John's one. I actually don't think things are as bad as it looks. Most important journalist ever, Magical Egypt stan.
Wow.
That's a win. Yeah.
I'll take it.
That's how I frame it anyway.
I'm going to quote you on that, darling. That's fabulous.
I think we're done now.
Yeah. But it is like I look and see, I see an ongoing enchantment happening, and that's a win. We look at, because, you know, in the trenches of it and having to get these things in front of people. But most important journalist ever, Magical Egypt stan. Come on. You know.
Good on you. Thank you. Wow. I'm going to be insufferable for about a week now.
Only a week.
No.
All right. So this series, because this kind of teed it up where you were talking about the occult there. And I think this is one of the changes in the time that John was fighting the good fight versus now, is the centrality of magic. So let's talk about that, because episode 1 is Heka. Like, what's Heka?
Well, actually, let me just step back for a second, because what's kind of cool about Magical Egypt is that it has evolved in and of itself, right? So season 1 is through the eyes of symbolists. Season 2 is through the eyes of artists. Season 3 is through the eyes of tantrists. And season 4 is through the eyes of magi, right? And so what it does is it kind of gives us a larger spectrum of information, right, about ancient Egypt when we start viewing it from all of these different perspectives. And where it kind of came from is this funny feeling that the show has been called Magical Egypt for more than 20 years, right?
The K was missing.
But it was kind of like, you know, how audacious of us to call our show Magical Egypt and not even look at magic. And as I was kind of explaining yesterday or earlier today, depending on how we edit it, magic has become a kind of an obsession for me personally. And while I'm very much a neophyte and I'm just kind of tinkering my fingers into the pool, I'm blessed to know some of the very best. I don't know, do I want to call you experts, right? But practitioners in
That's good.
the
Yeah.
magic space, right? And so just over the years, having talked to people and asked questions and like, what, how does Luxor work magically? And these kinds of questions, right? The answers that came back were so incredibly profound and interesting and yummy and delicious. And it was something that just kind of made my mind whirl. And so Chance and I would come back and Chance and I would talk about it. And, it was just, it was a matter of following our fascination, right? So ancient Egypt really is kind of the place, as far as I've become to understand, that magic really was at its peak. Okay, it was kind of at the epicenter of practicing and knowledge of magic,
High
right?
watermark.
The high watermark. There you go. Thank you very much. Right. So if you want to look at magic and understand magic, then ancient Egypt is a really great place to start.
It's only been very recently, by the way, that this group of people who are charismatic and they have this gift of gab. Yourself, eternal and fast friend of mine, Lon Duquette, because we were friends with Lon, and because of where we lived, Lon was the outer head of the OTO for a while when we first met, and so the Jack Parsons tradition and all the Crowleyites and all the OTO presence in Pasadena, and Lon really, in a weird way, made me, not in a weird way, in a very normal and understandable way. John hated the idea of the occult. He was grown up in that era where I was scared and it was the stuff of campfires. And then Lon, yourself, and this whole new breed of people, including Robert Bivol, we don't give Bivol nearly enough attention in the show, just this much smarter way of bringing the idea that, physics is so full of anomalies and the mysterious power of the brain over matter. And Egypt was this giant handbook of magical operation, but because of this weird bad marriage and this bad separation of, full of animosity between science and magic. By the way, as you know, so many of the scientists, our foundational scientists, were mystics and magicians.
Totally.
And so the people who really divorced society from the beautiful world of magic we used to live in are magicians themselves. So I wonder sometimes if it's kind of an arms race or gun regulation that let's restrict this incredibly powerful technology to the people in charge, which sure seems to bear out every year by year. But all of these people that really started adding color to our project were people of a later generation. And then this payload of people showed up, yourself and the whole younger generation that are not afraid to talk about it. There's no chance that any of us are going to get set on fire, put on the stake or anything. So it's a more liberal society, but also we're smarter. And also because of the internet, we've had our access unblocked to these important times in the past. Every 100 years, there's like a Rosicrucian revival. And it's just like everyone goes, yeah, of course, consciousness. And it's always been there. And magic has always worked. And then governments change and they want to start, neutering the kids and shutting magic down and keeping it in the hands of a few. When I would be bold enough and humble enough to say, you do not understand Egypt until you bring this bastard child that's been asked to leave the house.
And I would even say, because I think about this often, I would even say sequentially, and then we'll get back to Venice's story, because this is important for the series of Magical Egypt. One of the things Egypt does for me, and I got this through Graham Hancock, other sites in the world like Nan Madol that I've been to, same thing. You look at physical evidence of the impossibility of the official story, and that can wake anyone up. Right. Yeah. So there are people who are born sensitive. There are people like my friend up the road. She's been able to see spirits since she was a kid. Like she's never not been in the magical world. Most of us need to be able to look at something that is physically evident that the physical story is wrong. And Egypt will always bounce you out of official reality when you do that. Yeah. And if I look at the journey of Magical Egypt, it goes from like, look at this stuff, and look at the preposterous stories we're told about it, and you go, oh, well, okay, so the official story is wrong, and then you go on whatever your personal soul journey is because of it, right? And that's why Egypt is like, that's why Egypt's always the mirror of heaven, right? Why it's always magical, because it's like, look at this, right? Like, it
And by the
cannot
way,
be
look
here.
at this. This is you. This is a giant 3D
Exactly.
schematic of you. This
Yeah,
is
yeah.
all the stuff that nobody will tell you about yourself. And that's why curious minds and people who are really alive, not automated meat sacks that apparently put down on Earth to hold the Earth down. There's a small percentage of people are actually alive and awake and aware of this continuity of consciousness through multiple meat wagons. And those are the people that tend to have, well, first of all, a resonance and appreciation for art and aesthetics, which is kind of the litmus test of having a soul. And those people respond because there's something in your psyche. I've just read a really interesting thing recently that as you move from life to life, a lot of your conscious stuff can be suppressed, but there's something about the aesthetic knowledge and charge that your heart, the aesthetic sophistication that your art has, that your heart has developed over a series of lifetimes. You can't lose that. And so we have an emotional response, sort of like someone who's had their brain tampered with. You see your kids and you have this emotional response, but you don't remember why because you've had your hemisphere severed or something. We've been artificially manipulated, and just the process of multiple lives. There's some kind of thing you go through that, for merciful reasons, you don't remember the times that have happened in the past, but you have these weird psychic scars and intuitive understandings of things. That's why Magical Egypt has been so interesting, and why the incursion of psychedelics. You write a completely different story when your dowser is, responding to finer frequencies. And so when you approach this in the old way that we learned from the 60s and we learned from the shamanistic cultures throughout time, there's a pair of colored refractory lenses that you put on that is like a decoding ring for all of Egypt. And it's exactly what you said. And it's, for some reason, the crux of everything that's forbidden about modern society, which is why there's a whole industry built to shut you down the minute that the minute you make these points.
But I just want to go to something that Gordon said. I'm kind of like chief bottle washer, customer support, website builder, whatever. I do all the stuff. And one of the things that makes me most happy and just, fills my heart with joy is the number of people that do write to me and say, we watched Magical Egypt and it opened my eyes and it started my journey into X, Y, or Z,
What
right?
almost nobody says, the really intuitive ones, I'm so sorry, sweetie, is they say Magical Egypt made me remember something. It gave people contact, a connection with this bunch of information that they didn't know that they had in their head. And I love that. And you see people come alive and remember who they were last time, or remember this aptitude, or this people know in their heart. They have this built-in lie detector, and it's why Magical Egypt is not polished. It's not a commercial show, but it speaks with this weird, frenetic honesty that connects in a way that, like, there's something that is not my personality. That's the thing that's connects all my personalities that resonates with this, and I love it.
And let's get real, right? Magical Egypt 1 is now 25 years old. It's 720.
My hair was the color of yours, Gordon, when we started.
It's the standard definition. The camera work's shocking. The music's too loud, and it's still probably the most expensive documentary on the planet. And people are buying it today,
'Cause of my
right?
drug habit.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, that kind of speaks to its resonance, right? The power of it is that even in standard definition, people are buying it, right? And sharing it. And I've got a post on my, Facebook today, like brought me to tears. Like it really does have some juice, right? It has
Yeah.
some juice. And so it's a blessing. It really is a blessing to be able to do that for people.
This series, like, I think going back to what you were saying, that this series is the magicians. We've moved through different professions, I suppose, and so it's called Heka, which is magic both as a force and a being in ancient Egypt, and it's got some no slouch magicians, Dr. Stephen Skinner, one Milo Duquette. So it's a really, like, I've had people email me through the membership who've watched it already to say, I truly never thought I would see the day. Like, for me, like, I mean, so I that's lovely, right? But even if I wasn't, it's like another Magical Egypt moment for me, because I never thought I'd see the day of original Magical Egypt. And I never thought I'd see this day. I never thought I'd see, because, like, I got so much medicine out of Magical Egypt, obviously. But I wanted the magic stuff. It's like, yeah, that's true. Age of the Sphinx, etc., whatever. That's definitely true. but that's true because magic is real, right? And now we're at now we're at the season where we actually get to talk about. This is why I mentioned it earlier. John saying Egypt is a single issue civilization. I'm now in full agreement with him. If that issue is magic, if that issue is
That's exactly what it is.
that's
I
what
love
it is.
that.
All the pussyfooting around and all the careful posturing. And I really have this dark feeling about the propensity to say aliens, 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 because there's a much darker and much more foreboding and much more intimidating to the power structures. The idea that there was this entire era where people had this strange sort of personal empowerment and a connection to the universe. There was no middleman. Look at me and I'll tell you what's real. There was a moment. And as governments progressed, it was more and more important that this kind of stuff gets shut down. And so we have this whole superimposition of laws of physics that exclude magic and that we're not going to tell you.
paradigm.
Yeah, well, paradigm. There you go. I want to say, by the way, this is Venice's directorial editor debut. Like, she really took the reins on this. And if you notice, it has a much less blokey energy. It's a beautiful, beautiful show. I was the art director and I did the animation, but I just want to announce this is Venice's premiere as the actual showrunner and scriptwriter, and it's a beautiful piece because I tend to go dark when I'm talking about magic, and it's quite intimidating to people. Like espresso with no sugar in it when I do it, but then Venice comes along with a beautiful frappe that has the right sugar and a flower on top, and she's opened up magical Egypt to, first of all, another sex, one of the two sexes that was much less interested.
Yeah.
But anyway, I just want to say this episode is very much a product of Venice, and she really hit it out of the park. I need a lot of time to focus on my drug addictions and stuff, and so she steps in to pick it up and shamed me. No, she didn't shame me. It was a team, but it was a beautiful work, and I'm joking about all these things, but she did a fantastic. I just want to say she really deserves props, because if you notice a difference in energy, a rounding of the balance of energy, and there's some dark, but there's some light in the show, and it's just a beautiful thing that she's done. And I just want to call attention to the fact that this first episode of Heka, Venice was the pilot of the airplane.
Very nice. I know exactly what you mean about the tone and energy. That that explains it. There you go. That's very cool. And there is something really boyish about arguing the engineering impossibilities of the Great Pyramid. Like I went through that phase of like explaining precisely why it's right. There's a real kind of anorak, train spotting kind of energy to it sometimes, which can be a little bit exclusive to not just women, but I don't know, non-nerds.
I think that's a brilliant, insightful word to use. The show has had a hangover. John was I really am an intellectual child of John. And so when I was working on the first episode, of course, because he was around and he really had an axe to grind and an agenda, and he had a very specific way of looking at the world, that it was like him against Egyptology. And he had a very masculine, let's get in the boxing ring and settle this with our fists kind of energy sometimes. Because he had learned, I don't think he ever acknowledged it to himself, no amount of scientific knowledge, no amount of debating technique, no amount of sheer proof was ever going to change what the expert said, because we ultimately later found out it wasn't about what's true, it's about governing a society and keeping us from all being active
And he
magicians.
never got that. And he went to his grave wishing that academia would, and it's kind of, that's a little bit sad.
I think
took a
he's the last
generation of
person.
you
I'm
and
glad you
us.
say that, because I think he's the last person to do that, because Graham had half of that and has grown. No, I said grown out of it, but developed past it and realized that his he's one as well. Like, they're immaterial because no one listens. To go and spend $100,000+ US at the age of 18 to be served complete slop and then not get a job at the end of it, and the system has broken. And I that was John's sacred wound, his necessary flaw. We needed someone to have the infinite patience to do that, because now we don't have to do that. But he never saw it. It's a real intelligence of the heart stuff, which is funny, I guess. But no one ever wins any argument ever on fact. Like, it just doesn't happen. Like, you can hold the enemy at bay, but
You've just put your finger on the central problem with our culture, is that nothing is about what's true. Everything is about debate and oratory. And when you go to debate school, it's like, which side do you want to take? Well, I'm going to take the right side. No, you have to learn to debate on both sides. And the more you study this is really more, in my humble opinion, this is much more a management of regulating society through confining the things you're allowed to think and talk about, and absolutely restricting access to these traditions in the past that were self-empowering and made us ungovernable. I mean, it's not too hard to understand. And then for that mind, really, it's a magical castration in a way, because well, our pineal gland is physically castrated, I'm sure you know, which is a kind of a buzzkill for a lot of high-end in magical and tantric operations. But, you know, we're not completely castrated. So we've got a little nub there, calcified pineal gland in the whatever. Now it's all about the language and the sexy music. It's not like we can't do it anymore. It's just we've been incredibly truncated in our ability to do whatever that cosmic antenna is in the middle of us there. You know, it's somebody spray painted it, but we can still kind of see through it. And
Look, it's the
our
Kali
whole
Yuga. Though.
society
You can be
seems set up.
optimistic about it, right? Like in the Kali Yuga,
See-
you say the mantra once and you're guaranteed enlightenment. So I agree, and I actually do. I'm very interested in how to say this right. Very interested in having the right place for the maximizing of magic and general energy work. So in Tasmania, we have like red lights. We switch off like the Wi-Fi. We're doing everything we can to be able to do it, because this is the conditions of reality in this incarnation. That's what it is. Like we came down here to play in these rules, and they are what they are. I'm pretty oddly, I get to the end of Heka and I'm optimistic. Heading into World War III, but I'm like, but it's a sacred World War III. I don't know. There's something about a necessary transformation, which sounds really uncaring, but it's the opposite. It's to I don't know, to find the infinite meaning in the necessary and serious things we do. But
Can I just go ahead? Because it's reflective of my journey, really. Because we were hanging out during COVID, Gordon, and it was
Not
really
pleasant.
dark.
It was pleasant to
Yeah.
hang out with you, but
Yeah, I know you was exactly, but I mean, our
Until
state
the
of
alcohol
mind.
poisoning.
yeah.
But the state of mind that we were all in was really, really kind of. We were very depressed. I was depressed. You were depressed. He was depressed,
Listen,
and
we were, for people who aren't aware, this was made in Australia during those times, so there's a reason.
yeah, there's a reason, and that's why everybody's floating around in televisions, because we were not allowed to leave Australia to shoot the people that we wanted to shoot to put in the show. So we had to use Zoom, and so Chance, because he's such a visual artist, made this really great kind of set of televisions, and people are flying, and you're going through the museum, and all kinds of really great devices to try to make it as beautiful as I believe it is. But it is it's kind of two things. The intent was that when I started this journey, there were words that we use every day, words that we know what they mean, words we know how to spell, and words we can put in a sentence, but we don't grok them, right? There's so many things in our world that we take for granted, that we don't think about, that we don't understand. And so Heka is kind of talking about some of these things. It's kind of setting up an infrastructure for the other episodes that are going to come. So probably for your audience probably knows all of this already. But the average man on the street, when you talk to them about magic, they look at you like you're insane, right? They're like, what are you talking about? Now, what's really interesting is that, 75% of people believe in things like ghosts and astrology, but it's not operative, right? They have this kind of belief. And it's kind of, yes, I believe in ghosts, and yes, I believe in astrology, but that's where it stops. And it stops because of what Chance is talking about. A lot of the understanding of what's fundamental is muted. And so what I tried to do is I tried to kind of put us in a place in time now by showing the story of ancient Egypt and how it has morphed through the ages, and kind of tag on magic to that as well, right? And you made the point in the show that magic has been with us through history up until really the Enlightenment, and all of a sudden it's become something that we are not in relationship with anymore. And by showing kind of how we've looked at ancient Egypt, and how we've looked at science, and how we look at paradigm, and all of these kinds of things, I'm trying to paint a picture that will have people start looking at the reality around them a little bit and say, maybe things aren't the way that they
Yeah,
are
absolutely. So
understood
I
to be.
think I think it's perfectly named because in the foundations, which is the 6-month magic course in the premium member area, I have a breathing exercise that repeats the name Heka, 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 and I'm going to actually release that publicly for the sigils project that's going on next year. But it's such a powerful pattern interrupter because if I think about my experience with magic over the last amazing, because I'm still only 27, the last 25 years. I started with magic with a K. It annoyed me, and I made the political decision to drop the K from magic because magic is like when Crowley said it's frauds. Frauds just don't have the K on it. It's like yeah, that's part of magic. So I kept the C, and now we're in this point where that doesn't have enough currency either. And Heka is a pattern interrupt for people who think they know what's going on because it's magic, but it's a being. So it's actually centering you, relating you into a living cosmos way of doing it. And something I learned, speaking of the Sigils project in the show, that it never occurred to me to look at the etymology of Heka as a being, as magic. And in the show, so Ka is the image. It's a, let's just say astral form because there's several of them, but it's a spirit image of a being like a human or a god. And Het is to iterate. So it's to iterate or proliferate images. And I learned this in this episode, and I'm like, oh my God. That's magic, that's hermeticism, that's fractals, that's sigils when we come to use it, right? So that's why we're going to be using this notion out in the field. But I just got to the end of the episode and I'm like, Heka, it's perfectly named because it's the right pattern interrupt for people who, and I mean, I'm not saying they're not in this world, but even people who think they're in this world or think they know this stuff, there's something really medicinal about like, pattern interrupting that. So, this is that Magical Egypt show. This is about like symbolism, John Ashley. Yeah, it is. Heka. Like, let's do it.
Oh, I love that, God. I think we're just going to have to put you on marketing, darling. This is just so amazing.
It's a very funny thing. And there is this, having gone to school, I know you're like this. I enjoyed your book, by the way. And you have these very insightful commentaries. The one that really hit me, because I haven't said this out loud enough, it's impossible to understand how much mental conditioning and mental caging we've been taught. And in the post-material, post-enlightenment process, it really was like a process of castration of our spiritual bodies. That movie Golden Compass, by the way, good God, as an allegorical movie that shows us being migrated out of a living world into this world of ideas that are dead. They're dead and they're not necessarily true. And that it's an ideological cage that's done by removing our connections to this living infrastructure. And society itself is this giant disempowering machine. And then that's why there's such a resistance to people who tell the truth. Like, we are so suppressed. And the only thing that I can think of is not only are we providing really plausible challenges to the historical timeline, but who would care about that? It's the power of the people who presume to tell us what we are. And those people are there specifically because they're telling us this very truncated version. So we're depowered literally by an artificial mirror that shows us this part of ourselves that's only physical and mechanical. And so there's a weird bias, old school bias, not stupid new biases that are just like, no, you can't see this because feelings. This was a careful psychological, surgical removal of these traditions from us, specifically so that everyone that's normal thinks magic is stupid and that we're utterly disempowered and we live in an unconscious material universe.
But here's what's the reflection of that is that, as I said, I'm a neophyte, right? I've done a little bit of sigil. I've done a little bit of invoking. This shit works, right?
Yeah.
Like I was
Denise
literally
went through a phase. She was a demon for a while at sigils. When someone was sitting at a table in a restaurant we wanted, that sigil thing would come out and God damn it, those people would leave.
That's why I'm so excited to do a sigil a day. But like I hit a wall, right? I hit a wall and I'm like, I don't know how I'm going to finish this. And it was just like, I was pulling my hair out and I'm like, okay, what am I going to do? And I'm like, oh my God, that is right, Hermes. Like, I mean, like if there's nobody that can help me more. And so I did a ritual and I did some invocations and I finished the script in like 3 hours after that. You know what I mean? It's like,
I know exactly what you mean. Yeah.
Hey, can I call attention to one more thing? Speaking of that, because this probably will never come up if nobody says it. I believe in the entirety of human civilization. Nobody's ever made a 90-minute documentary in 32 days before. And Vanese had this several unholy alliances with new kinds of AI, lots of children that didn't work. They were born with 6 arms and stuff. But then suddenly, out of all of these unholy things, the show just, bam, came to life in this way that she really danced with the digital devil and made this thing that was, I mean, I don't know if it's ever been done before, 90-minute documentary in 32 days. I did all the animation. I had nothing to do with this. Well, no, we both consulted on the script and I did a couple of nips and tucks at the end, but this just pure expression from her, plus her crazy knowledge of administrative, like I am that worst nightmare for administrative, and I will not be put into a schedule of any kind. It's just absolute poison to me. But she was exactly the opposite. And we did this whole thing like a little gumball machine, ding, 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 ding. And 32 days, whole documentary, never been done before.
Amazing. Brilliant. Well, speaking of, where do people go to see it? Where do they go to find out more? And
Just magicalegypt.com, darling.
Wonderful, wonderful. And episode 1 is out, and this episode of the show will be out before Christmas. So, what are we looking? What's coming up next?
What is coming up? Well, first of all, the goal is to have an episode out every 90 days. I'm giving myself 3 times longer and Chance 3 times longer to do them.
Imagine no happy hours for 32 days. We're like, that's untenable.
Yeah.
It's not
Hey,
working.
look, we were telling you before, I took this year off booze, so I can definitely.
Yeah.
I can see it, by the way.
See, you look fabulous, darling.
Yeah.
That's a huge one. Everyone should know that. Take a month off from alcohol and you'll go back to being 18 years old.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right.
But as I said, this one really is an introductory. So it's kind of introducing the people that are in the upcoming episodes, and it's more of a framework. And so it's probably more essential for the people that are like magical curious rather than magical experienced, right? And so I'm so glad that at least Heka was of value to you. That blew my mind too. Mog Morgan and his.
That was very The upper cell. I think what I. Because I know Skinner's over and whatever as well, and it's really well introduced in there. But Lon telling that famous story of how he got the job in the car, which is in his books, I know it. At the end of that episode is just like, that's worth it. Lon telling that story at the end, which everyone, because people listening to this episode will know that story. They haven't heard it like this. It was. Wrapped. I thought that was fantastic. So it's really like, it's been, like I said, well done. Well done making magical Egypt again, in the sense of bringing a paradigm shift or a pattern interrupt.
Thank you,
to something that was already pattern interrupted. So like, well done. It's a personal honor to be a small part of that. Like,
oh no, sweetie, you were a big part.
So
yeah, I just want to really make people understand that you have talked to me. I've been a member. I've read your books. You shifted my paradigm, darling. So I mean, I really need to give a huge amount of thanks to you, because you've been incredibly influential.
There's a psychic profile, a mental profile. I don't want to say anything as vulgar as IQ, but there's a certain kind of mind that always responds well to this. And for the longest time, the reductionists and all the people like the guy you mentioned before, the materialists, always had a relationship to this stuff. And then there was always like that other side, the Gaia UFO channel kind of thing. There was just people who didn't particularly feel the need to rely on facts or anything. They were just telling a story, like a campfire story. And then there's this whole new generation of people that came along, like yourself, that straddle both lines. And it's perfectly okay to pursue these old magical arts rewrapped as physical phenomena that we don't understand. We don't understand fields. We don't understand that torus around us that follows us everywhere and allows psychic. There's so much that we've had reduced, and all the limbs we've had trimmed off of our tree. And one of the problems I've always had, and the reason why Magical Egypt went dark for 10 or 12 years is I've been waiting for a new generation of people like yourself, Gordon, who can walk that line between you never abandon the rope of science and reason And there's so much meat on the bone without having to resort to UFOs and craziness. And the whole idea that there's this thing that all of humanity's believed in just in the last 200 years, we don't believe anymore, which is consciousnesses that exist outside of the body, the consciousness of fabric of reality is conscious. And suddenly when you start understanding that the air and the space and the room in you is a conscious entity, that the universe is a conscious entity, suddenly magic isn't weird or outlier. Magic is this thing that we've all had taken away from us. And it's the only thing that explains the universe. And you will never understand the universe unless you start at least trying to assimilate the models of magic and why our consciousness would have a bounce back or a boomerang effect, or our consciousness is resonant enough with the fabric of reality that if you understand it and you haven't been psychically neutered, this is the one dick you can grow back after it's been cut off, is you restore your faith in the consciousness of the fabric of reality. And suddenly you're a magician. It's your identity changes, your relationship to the universe changes, and suddenly you connect with this 10,000-year-long lineage, a responsibility to humanity that was literally surgically snipped, what's that called, circumcised from modern psyche.
And you can feel, like you are saying, Gordon, you feel hopeful.
Changes the fabric of your life, the optimism.
It does. It feels like coming home. That's what it was for me. Yeah. Well, lovely chat.
Thank you so much for
thank you,
having me.
Mercury retrograde, for letting us get to the end of this.
Freddie Mercury retrograde, my favorite time of year.
Exactly. Got 2 or 3 massive disasters. But an amazing chat in and amongst the retrograding. Wonderful stuff. Congratulations on the episode. Congratulations on the series. MagicalEgypt.com for everyone. Fantastic.
And it's an honor for us to be on Rune Soup, just so you know, darling. This is like a highlight for us too. So we're like, woo, we've made it,
I
baby.
was in the room when you interviewed Aaron Cheek, and I'm like, what does that bastard have that I don't have?
All right, my love.
Awesome. All
Thank you
right.
so
Thanks,
much.
guys.